Good evening. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone in the Darwin Lecture Theatre today and the many who are joining us online. The chair of the Collaborative Social Science domain, Professor Kerry Jewett, unfortunately is unable to welcome everyone here today due to a positive COVID test. Therefore, the great pleasure of introducing today's inaugural lecture and by way of saying a few words about the domain has fallen to me as co-chair of the Early Career Network. So the UCL's Collaborative Social Science domain was established in 2016 to foster collaboration across UCL. This includes collaborations between the different social sciences, the natural and applied sciences, and the humanities across all the departments and faculties at UCL. Through a program of engagement and impact activities, we seek to build UCL's capacity in this domain through a range of events and networks. We try to encourage methodological innovation, establish collaborative networks that cut across disciplines, and our work includes the Early Career Network, a PhD network, UCL's Sociology Network, talks and events like today, workshops and training, funding opportunities, and a podcast series. You can find out the latest of our events and news on the domain's website or following us on Twitter. This UCL Collaborative Social Science Inaugural Lecture is a collaboration with and sponsored by Sage Publications. I now hand over to my colleague and another co-chair of the Early Career Research Network, Dr. Meghna Nag Chowdhury, who will introduce tonight's esteemed speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. Welcome, everyone. As Ned just introduced, I'm also one of the members of the Early Career Researchers Network, which is hosted by CSSD. And we're really, really happy to have with us today's speaker, Professor Vineeta Sinha, who's based at the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. She obtained her MA and PhD in Anthropology from Johns Hopkins University, and her research and teaching interests include areas such as Hindu religiosity in the diaspora, religion-state encounters, religion commodification consumption practices, and also really interesting work around critiques of concepts and categories in the social sciences. She has extensively published books and peer-reviewed articles, including the book called Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, from which I believe this image is from, and also monographs such as A New God in the Diaspora, Religion and Commodification, Religion-State Encounters in Hindu Domains, etc. She's a vice president of the International Sociological Association and co-editor of the Asian Journal of Social Sciences. And we're very, very honored to have you here today to speak to us and looking forward to hearing from you. Just a side note, there's a Slido event code written here. If anybody has any questions as she speaks, please add them to the Slido event website, and we'll take them later in a couple of minutes after we hear Professor Vineeta. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this very generous introduction and such a warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here this evening to deliver this inaugural lecture at the Collaborative Social Science domain at UCL. I would very much like to thank Professor Kerry Jewett and Michael Reed for inviting me. And I'm sorry that Kerry is not able to join us this evening, and I wish her speedy recovery. I also want to express my appreciation to Dr. Meghna Nag Chowdhury and Dr. Ned Barker, who have stepped in to facilitate today's event. I really appreciate that. And I also look forward to an opportunity to engage with members of the Early Career Research Network tomorrow in the masterclass, so I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much. So I've decided not to have too many PowerPoint slides. You know, we all have heard about death by PowerPoint, and so I thought I would avoid that. This is the title of the lecture today, Cross-disciplinary conversations, sites for decolonizing conceptual frames, methodologies, and pedagogies. Allow me to, before I start, I should say that I have a prepared text, so please allow me to read the text, because then I'll make sure that I'll say everything that I need to say within the time that's specified. So allow me to begin with some brief remarks on the history of universities by offering some contextual grounding for the arguments that follow. Given my commitment to non-Eurocentric histories, I begin by acknowledging the presence of centers of learning which developed independent traditions of scholarship globally. This pushes back the timeline for the establishment of universities and notes their foundation beyond European shores. Admittedly, histories of universities as centers of learning in Europe, America, and non-European contexts are diverse, complicated, and layered. In non-European contexts, we know of the very renowned Buddhist monastic university at Nalanda, which was founded in 427 CE, which promoted arts and academics, grammar, medicine, logic, mathematics, astronomy, and politics. We also know about the Confucian schools for the Mandarin bureaucracy of Imperial China, which trained bureaucrats, and the Tokugawa Han schools, which were established for the Japanese samurai. And of course, the Al-Azhar University, which was established in 972 CE as the center of Islamic learning, is very well known and has been written about extensively. There's also excellent historical work on the Aztec and Inca temple schools for the priestly astronomers of pre-Columbian America. Diversity certainly marks the development of universities in Europe and North America. No singular model of the university existed in Britain, France, and Germany, for example. In a medieval European context, universities served as guilds and had ecclesiastical grounding, and schools issued secular and non-secular degrees. In a European context, industrialization and modernization provided the trigger for the development and dominance of the natural sciences in university curricula and normalized the idea that universities would and should develop along secular lines. During the 19th century, public universities for the masses became more widespread and transitioned into secular institutions, a shift from the earlier dominant emphasis on religion, which had shaped the curriculum, and further a move away from universities as elite, research-centric institutions. By the middle of the 20th century, with the formal end of European colonial rule in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and Africa, British, Dutch, German, and French university templates had been firmly established in the former colonies. Importantly, these universities not only inherited the organizational and structural contours of their European counterparts, but also received technical and financial assistance from the former colonial powers and funding agencies therein. However, it is notable that there were some prominent examples of universities which were established in the colonies as alternatives to European higher education models. I'm familiar with the Indian context, and let me cite the example of the Aligarh Muslim University, the Banaras Hindu University, and Rabindranath Tagore's Vishwa Bharat University, founded in 1921, which were all really formulated as nationalist projects to present an alternative university template in the Indian context. The rise of autonomous disciplines in European universities is dated to the 19th century as modes of organizing and delivering specialized knowledge. Repko defines a discipline as, I quote, a particular branch of learning or body of knowledge whose defining elements, that is phenomena, assumptions, epistemology, concepts, and methods distinguish it from other knowledge formations, end of quote. These separate academic disciplines in the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities provided organizational structure to the modern universities. Distinct teaching and research units, that is departments, offered instruction and degrees in specialized curricula. The story of Durkheim's attempt to institutionalize and professionalize sociology in France at the close of the 19th century is well known. The text, The Rules of Sociological Method, is certainly seen as a classic methodological text, but it is perhaps even more interesting as a document that made a case for the distinction of sociology as an autonomous discipline with a specific subject matter unlike any other existing discipline at the time. It was primarily addressed to university administrators and policymakers to persuade them that a separate department of sociology should be established with faculty members, students, a separate curriculum, and of course funding. The organization of universities with departments, sorry, I'm still talking about the introduction, I forgot that. This is the only slide I have. The organization of universities with departments housing separate disciplines has firmly persisted and was also transported to the colonies. Interestingly, however, in many non-European universities, for example, in Southeast Asia and South Asia, there was also the pattern of single departments housing multiple disciplines, often due to lack of resources. For example, sociology and anthropology coexisted in the same department in universities in Singapore, Malaysia, India, Philippines, and Vietnam, amongst some of these contexts. In this joint shared existence, the disciplines in question developed integrated curricula and research agendas, and descriptors such as social anthropology were adopted to describe the common ground between sociology and anthropology. Interestingly, more recently too, discussions about the value of instituting joint combined departments as a way of breaking down disciplinary boundaries and encouraging conversations have been proposed and experimented with. But over time, academic disciplines have also found allies with specific sectors in labor markets, while disciplinary expertise has also determined recruitment practices in universities. For these reasons, there has been some resistance to the idea of dissolving disciplinary boundaries institutionally. Let me move to the next section, which is entitled Disciplinary Encounters. Despite the existence of discipline-specific departments, the idea that encounters across disciplinary boundaries is desirable has long been recognized. The language of dialogue, intersections, interface, making connections, border and boundary crossings, synthesis, and integration have been invoked to denote borrowings and learnings from methodologies and concepts across disciplines. For example, anthropology and qualitative sociology have long been approached as cognate disciplines, even though their historical trajectories are distinct. While they share methodological similarities, they also embody different disciplinary practices and define the subject matter and theoretical frameworks differently. In another example, attempts have long been made to see points of convergence between history and anthropology, both in the UK and the USA, particularly on the question of methodologies in use. Anthropologists on both sides of the Atlantic have recognized that cultural understanding has long been mediated by historical perspectives going back to the 1940s. In diverse sociocultural settings, anthropologists and historians have experimented with this convergence and attempted to draw on ethnology, oral traditions, archival work, and folklore to produce historically informed cultural accounts of communities. Expressions such as ethno-history, historical anthropology, and anthropological history have been proposed. These approaches see value in the interface of the ethnographer's method of immersive fieldwork and the historian's concern with time frames, providing valuable perspectives for theorizing the ongoing dialectic of past and present. In more recent times, too, disciplinary interactions have been described using interesting terminologies. Some popular expressions that we are all familiar with include multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and transdisciplinaries. And attempts have been made to identify analytical differences amongst these. But some of these terms have a long history as well. For example, interdisciplinarity. Andrew Abbott has noted that the term interdisciplinary was used as early as 1937 in the Journal of Educational Sociology. Of course, in recent times, within the context of a neoliberal climate, the term interdisciplinary has taken on rather different registers. Klein has suggested that a multidisciplinary perspective connotes the juxtaposition of disciplines around particular research problems, and that this is essentially additive, not integrative. Transdisciplinary approach to research is defined as more comprehensively integrative and synthetic, where disciplinary boundaries and even temporality are transcended, and where research is problem-based, requiring skills and competencies from multiple disciplines. Another feature of transdisciplinarity that has appealed to many is the idea, according to Venkataraman Hayes, who says, I quote, that transdisciplinary means moving beyond the academy into dialogue with the private sector, the public sector, and community and stakeholders, end of quote. Interestingly, a hierarchy of sort has emerged where Disciplinarity is placed at the bottom of the barrel, followed by interdisciplinarity with transdisciplinary at the apex. These terminological and analytical distinctions have been debated and critiqued, even as there is growing support for them. In one particular critique, it has been suggested that the idea of integration and synthesis of concepts and methodologies is somewhat ambiguous, which has proved challenging to demonstrate in practice. Of these options, the notion of interdisciplinarity has emerged as a front runner and found favor, particularly in institutional contexts. Since the 1980s and 1990s, university management and especially funding agencies the world over have embraced the notion of interdisciplinary studies with some enthusiasm, and even new academic units dedicated to interdisciplinary teaching, learning, and research have been created. A strange but perhaps not unexpected alliance is evident between the logic of neoliberalism and the notion of what has been called instrumental interdisciplinarity by scholars like Lorenz and Tabulawa. Tabulawa has argued that interdisciplinary is a mode of organizing knowledge which is aligned with the instrumentalization of knowledge and market rationality. He makes the further point that, I quote, interdisciplinarity is not some neutral, apolitical, technical rearrangement of knowledge. Rather, it is a political technology implicated in attempts to break academics' monopoly on the processes and products of higher education. I bring up the alliance between neoliberalism and interdisciplinarity because I see that this is another space where there is a need for decolonizing efforts. At the level of teaching, this move towards interdisciplinarity has been presented as innovative in being student-centered, affording them flexibility and choice to curate their own learning experiences. The logic is that this approach will allow building of bridges between disciplines and enable students to acquire cross-disciplinary breadth, which it has been argued leads to effective and meaningful problem solving, rather than simply narrowly trained students in single isolated disciplines. Unfortunately, in this narrative, disciplines and disciplinary training have been stereotyped and somewhat caricaturized in being presented as insulated, narrow, and limited. Let me move to the next part of the lecture, which is where I begin to talk about my own efforts to deal with working across disciplines. Rather than speak in generalities and abstractions, allow me to turn to my own work as an educator and researcher to demonstrate and exemplify the claims I make about the value of cross-disciplinary engagements. While trained and grounded in the disciplines of qualitative sociology and anthropology, I have drawn on methodologies and theoretical insights from history. I have found that an eclectic mix of disciplines and research methodologies has been productive in theorizing socio-economic, political, cultural, and religious domains in Singapore and Malaysia, where I've done the bulk of my primary work. Driven by my commitment to decolonizing disciplines, these border crossings have created spaces and opportunities for focusing a critical lens on existing disciplinary conceptual frameworks, methodologies, and pedagogies, and have allowed me to conceive strategies for alternative ways of thinking about the same. So let me turn to my pedagogy first. I begin by sharing some of my teaching experiences at the National University of Singapore. Having spent my undergraduate years in a joint department of sociology and anthropology at NUS, I have a keen interest in disciplinary histories. As a practitioner, I'm also curious to know how sociology and anthropology have been translated into practice in particular sociocultural, political, and institutional locations. Sociological and anthropological theories, their history and teaching have engaged me as an educator, but what began as teaching assignments have over time evolved also into core research interests as I interrogate how sociological and anthropological theories have been defined and their canons constructed partially and selectively. Thus, a key strand of my work is in reimagining the disciplines of sociology and anthropology from Southeast Asian and South Asian regions through the lens of decolonizing knowledge production and asking what it might mean to reconfigure these disciplines from Asia through post-colonial and decolonial lenses. I have argued that it's important to move beyond critique and notice of blind spots in the historiography of sociology and anthropology. It is important, in addition, to reorganize the teaching of these disciplines and curate radical and foundational curricular reform, which is what I have tried to do. Now, without being prescriptive and completely respecting the autonomy of individuals to craft their own course materials, I do contend that it is critical to challenge the sociological and anthropological canon, which are often reproduced unreflexively in syllabi and curricula in universities globally. Creating spaces for engaging received disciplinary wisdom critically and historicizing and deconstructing the same, I argue, pays great pedagogical dividend. Interestingly, I have found that insisting on the historical sensitivities and sensibilities in the teaching of sociology and anthropology modules has sometimes led students and even peers to complain that there is too much history in these sociology and anthropology modules. But I have embraced this as an occupational hazard, and I welcome these responses as opportunities to reiterate and demonstrate the value of history to sociology and anthropology students. So let me cite two concrete examples from my teaching. The first example comes from teaching an essential undergraduate module called Social Thought and Social Theory, which I have taught at the National University of Singapore for some time now. This module introduces sociology majors to the discipline's canon, that is the writings of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. This is a template that's familiar to universities and departments of sociology globally. Much of the thinking on sociological theory and the history of social thought is informed by a subject-object dichotomy. This is a dominant, if unarticulated, principle which has determined who is recognized as a knowing, thinking subject, as producer of ideas and knowledge. Invariably, non-Europeans have not routinely appeared as these subjects in the history of sociological thought. Rather, they are approached predominantly either as objects of study and at best as suppliers of data. It is extremely rare to find non-Westist thinkers being featured as a source of sociological thought, located in Asia and Africa, for example, who thought systematically about the process of modernity that took place in their societies too, and some of whom were contemporaries with such luminaries as Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. The failure to acknowledge that non-European social thinkers have also theorized the emergence of modernity is particularly scandalous, given the overwhelming evidence for their presence and certainly visibility of their work. I must say that in the last 5 to 10 years, this has begun to change in a positive direction, so I'm quite happy to see that. I have co-taught this module, Social Thought and Social Theory, in a reconfigured mode with my colleague Said Farid Alatas. Some of you might know him, who is a very well-known sociologist. We have curated this module afresh to demonstrate particularly the biases of Eurocentrism and androcentrism in the sociological canon, while engaging critically with the same. We have taken the position that recognizing these limits within the historiography of sociology does not lead to passivity and inertia. Invisibility and silencing are two sides of the same coin. Thus, unsilencing and making visible have been key strategies of the decentering project that we have undertaken in this module. Not surprisingly, this has also been met with some resistance and critique from colleagues and students. I can go into the details later on if there's interest. A strategy that we have both used has been to source, include, and render visible silenced, marginalized, and obscured voices and personas as key players in the history of sociological thought. For example, we have introduced such thinkers as Ibn Khaldun, Jose Rizal, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, and Said Nursi, who have been listed on the module's reading list. We have assigned their intellectual biographies, we have assigned their primary works, we have invited students to debate and critique them as well, all in an effort to expand the range of sociological theorizing of modernity from diverse locations and in the hands of a range of different historical actors. The problem of androcentrism, which is male domination, in the sociological canon has received even less attention than its Eurocentric biases, which is a real pity. Gender discrimination, gender politics, and patriarchal domination in academia have led to the marginalization and invisibility of women's theoretical and other contributions to the discipline of sociology. Expectedly, women thinkers do not feature in too many undergraduate or postgraduate classical sociological theory, syllabi, and curricula in universities everywhere. This, even though there is a wealth of published research about women social thinkers in different societal contexts, which has been growing since at least the 1970s. The non-presence of women thinkers and theorists in the discipline's archives has been noted in this scholarship, as well as the neglect of the work they have produced. As such, women thinkers continue to be located on the periphery, if not outside the discipline of sociology. This is not just a function of marginalizing women thinkers, but also the vast scholarship about them that has been produced in the last 50 years. Therefore, in this module, we have deliberately introduced figures like Harriet Martineau, Pandita Ramabai Saraswati from India, and Florence Nightingale, Harriet Martineau and Florence Nightingale being British women, from a long list of women social thinkers and theorists, and also presented their primary ideas and works in the classroom, inviting students to engage with them critically. Introducing these social thinkers located in diverse sociocultural and political settings who grappled with the experience and impact of modernity allows us to present to students an alternative history of sociology, and is also a critical step in practicing critical pedagogy. Additionally, the module has given priority to historical events and processes that are often missing in mainstream modes of introducing the sociological canon, that is especially the processes of colonization and decolonization. Our experience has been that diverse and inclusive curricula not just inform students, but also inspire them to engage received wisdom critically. And very often when we have introduced thinkers from different parts of the world, students themselves have come up to us and suggested names of figures that we could look at or they could look at. And so when we present this list of names to students, we are not presenting this as the only list of possibilities, but it's really an invitation for others who are more familiar with other civilizational contexts to contemplate, who else might be out there that we haven't had the opportunity to know about yet. This has therefore helped us as educators to take concrete steps to materialize the larger project of decolonizing knowledge production through interrupting a mechanical and unreflexive reproduction of the sociological canon. The second example is drawn from a graduate module that I teach at NUS. It's called Anthropological Perspectives. Assuming a historical lens, this module explores the emergence of anthropological thought in Britain and the USA, as well as the modes in which disciplinary practices were institutionalized in the former colonies in Southeast Asia and South Asia. While the historical lens offers a critical starting point for engaging the discipline's past, the module highlights continuities between received anthropological legacies and contemporary disciplinary practices, and the module attempts to critique inherited traditions and highlights new disciplinary practices that have been conceived and are beginning to materialize. Paying close attention to the layered relationship between colonialism and anthropology, this module interrogates the production of anthropological objects of inquiry and its subjects, as well as the knowledge claim that the discipline has made. It's important to highlight that a lot of these critiques have been taking place in the context of research that has been produced, and anthropology has long been criticized in the way that it has conceived its objects of study. What's I think the difference is that one needs to bring these things into the classroom, because the classroom can actually become an arena for introducing students to some of the cutting edge work that is being done by researchers, and also allowing students to see that it is possible to critique received wisdom and contemplate alternatives. Infusing anthropology with historical sensibilities, and especially acknowledging the entanglement of the discipline with colonial processes, has led me to interrogate the category native and its conceptualization, both as a logic that has framed the subject matter and subjects of anthropology, as well as an identity marker imposed on other non-European informants as well as anthropologists, a process that I argue persists in the present in intriguing and disturbing modes. I have argued that the category native signifies a particularizing rather than a universalizing category, with non-native as its corollary. Every reference to the category native, I argue, marks difference and is associated with the colonized, the indigenous, the marginalized, the powerless, and the peripheral. Its utterance continues to objectify, marginalize, and dehumanize the party in question. The continued invocation of natives and others as subjects of anthropology is a reminder to students of the embedded power inequalities between natives and non-natives. I would also argue that the term native has, in practice, been replaced by kindred substitutes, but the conceptualizations continue even with new terminologies. In this context, categories like native anthropologist and indigenous anthropologists, often imposed selectively on non-European practitioners of the discipline, are equally problematic. These descriptors translate into problematic notions about what natives who are anthropologists can and cannot accomplish, who, what, and which societies they can study and do research with, and whether they can be objective in reporting on their own societies. By not recognizing these practitioners as producers of theory and anthropological knowledge, they are denied equal standing with their peers from beyond non-European shores. Scholarly contributions from non-Europe have typically not had a theoretical universal appeal, given that the non-West divide insinuates an epistemic binary and only superficially references a spatial geographical dichotomy. I propose to students that an uncomfortable silencing, containment, and marginalization of native expert voices follows when the work they produce is framed as native ethnography or an anthropology. Let me move to the research part of my work to show how I have benefited by learning in particular from history. As a student of global migration and diaspora religion, mobilities of persons, objects, deities, ideas, and materialities across boundaries in colonial and post-colonial moments have been central to my work. My current book project, which I'm glad to say is nearing completion, is entitled Temple Tracks, Labor Mobility, Piety. This book attends to the entangled historical and ethnographic narratives of colonial railway construction, Indian labor migration, and religion making by labor in regions once marked as British Malaya. I argue that the history of railway construction in British Malaya offers a powerful lens for narrating the interlocking accounts of Indian, Hindu labor migrations into these regions and the sacralization of these landscapes in the building of Hindu temples along the railway tracks and within railway premises like railway stations and railway colonies. What is striking about this research for me is that the landscapes, the railway landscapes, were sacralized by railway laboring communities who also materialized the modern transportation and communication infrastructure in these regions. Multiple journeys have grounded this research, including my travels and fieldwork as an ethnographer and as a closet historian, scrutinizing official railway archives, as well as perusing private archives that I have uncovered through fieldwork. Here, cross-disciplinary encounters have meant bringing history and anthropology into conversation through the methodologies of ethnography and archival research, rethinking and reconfiguring both in this process. An important analytical move in this project was to recognize what I have called the non-laboring lives of labor, rather than focus exclusively on their economic productive capacities. I turned to official railway archives to abstract representations of labor therein. Not surprisingly, when labor is mentioned in these reports, it is always with reference to their productive capacities, and when labor welfare is mentioned, it's always with reference to housing, health, wages, sometimes education, and even more occasionally, recreational and labor union activities. There is no indication here about the sociocultural or religious lives of these laboring groups or what they did in their leisure time, because these were irrelevant to their primary identity as laborers. Archival records typically document big macro histories, whereas lay, everyday histories find no place in these documents. The marginal and invisible character of everyday religiosity in these historical records and other archival materials has prompted me to search for other sites where I could learn about the non-laboring lives of labor, and this has led me to, as I said, private archives. A lot of these private archives were actually kept in temples, so I call them temple archives as well, and I was also able to rely on families which had private photographs and other images, as well as the memories and recollections of individuals who had been involved in the building of the railways in Malaya. In doing so, I have turned to private archives and biography as sites where knowledge can be produced in a cooperative endeavor with research interlocutors. I argue that taking these sites seriously signals that individual stories and voices, personal experiences, private collections of documents and images are sources of legitimate and meaningful knowledge. Indeed, they have something to say and teach us about ethnography and history. But in turning to the archives, I continue to struggle with the question of how an anthropologist's approach to the archives differs from that of a historian, if at all. What difference does an anthropological and ethnographic lens make to the project of perusing and reconfiguring the archives? Libera has suggested that historical materials are deemed to be sources for historians, whereas anthropologists view these as texts, something that I do agree with. He has further noted that, and I quote, "An anthropologist and a historian will never find identical facts in the same material." I find the binary of historical facts and anthropological facts a little problematic, and of course the invocation of facts for an anthropologist is also very problematic. I also do not wish to stereotype historical versus anthropological approaches to the archives in monolithic terms, given the tremendous diversity of views and practices within both disciplines. But in turning to archival work as an anthropologist, I have revisited a question that has long been asked by others like Bernard Cohn and Saloni Mathur. The question is this: how does an anthropologist think about the archives, particularly in a colonial and post-colonial context? Cohn has observed back in 1980 that, I quote, "Archives are cultural artifacts which encompass the past and present," end of quote. While Mathur has proposed that for the anthropologists, the archives become, in her words, increasingly understood as a valid ethnographic site. These ideas resonate with this book project, which I have conceived in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Therefore, I have approached official archives, which carry the imprint of colonial power inequalities, as spaces where knowledge claims are made, which are not accepted at face value, but which merit analysis and interpretation. I have not viewed these as repositories of objective truths or facts, but as discourses and narratives which have been socially and historically constructed and must be unpacked. The implications of the attendant explicit and implicit inequalities for assessing claims of objectivity, authenticity, and plasticity of the knowledge produced merit scrutiny as well. As an anthropologist, therefore, I am interested in abstracting ethnography from archival material as I prioritize the human input in the careful curation of official archives, something that has often been obscured and ignored as subjective and therefore irrelevant. Rethinking the archives as ethnographic sites populated with knowledge claims articulated by historical actors with interests and agendas has interestingly led me to interrogate and problematize anthropological notions of ethnography, field site, and anthropological data. Indeed, if the archives can be considered an ethnographic site, what else can be an ethnographic site? This has been productive for me in conceiving alternative ways of conceptualizing how field and field sites as well as fieldwork have been understood. This book has demanded that I work with a radically different notion of field site. I have mapped railway and religious infrastructures historically and in the present in British Malaya and in the contemporary nation states of Singapore and Malaysia. And these have constituted sites where I have done fieldwork, but these have also been subjected to historical analysis. This logic has massively expanded conceptions of the field and field sites in this project and has unsettled the priority typically assigned to field sites bounded in time and space. Both religious and railway infrastructures, and as I said, the length of the railway tracks themselves connoted field sites for me, and I approached these as social spaces that merged human, non-human, and humanly constructed worlds. Many of my fieldwork encounters and exchanges with interlocutors occurred on my multiple rail and road journeys, and many of these encounters were indeed fleeting and episodic and would not satisfy the rigorous conditions of long-term, immersive, sustained fieldwork. I was aware that in some quarters, these short-term conversations would be suspect as superficial exchanges incapable of generating meaningful knowledge. This did surface questions about the epistemological status of what are considered isolated and passing snippets of conversations, interviews, fragments really, accessed in specific moments without opportunities for seeking collaborations, clarifications, and confirmations, all things that are possible in immersive fieldwork and in-depth interviews. However, at the end of my research journeys, the knowledge and insight that was generated in conversation with interlocutors in this manner have allowed me to demonstrate that these apparent fleeting fieldwork encounters were consequential and carried enormous importance for the course of my work. I've therefore proposed what I've called doing an ethnography on the move, and I should explain this. Part of my fieldwork required me to actually travel on the train, so I traveled multiple times on the trains on the west coast and the east coast of Malaysia, from Singapore to the border of Malaysia and Thailand, and many of the conversations that I had happened on the train itself, because part of my project was to actually plot and survey railway temples from the moving train itself, because many of these temples were actually along the railway tracks. So traveling by train was the key aspect of my fieldwork. I just want to clarify that I've not proposed here, ethnography on the move as a kind of a fashionable innovation for immersive fieldwork experiences, but I argue that in the context of this research, I found this strategy to be appropriate as a mode of generating data. And given the primacy that anthropology has accorded to long-term in-depth fieldwork in bounded spaces, the idea of generating data while moving is disruptive, but also enabling precisely because it disturbs and unsettles long-standing, taken for granted epistemological and ontological edicts of ethnographic research. With that, let me move to the last section of the talk. Interrogating decolonizing concepts, methodologies, pedagogies. There are compelling grounds for decolonizing disciplines in teaching and research practices, which I see as critical, political, and emancipatory projects. The remit of this task is colossal and challenging, but also exciting. Rethinking methodological and theoretical foundations of disciplines needs to reach the very institutional, academic, and professional structures that sustain them. Given this commitment, how can one think about disciplinary cooperation and collaboration in productive modes? Historically, attempts to bring disciplines into dialogue institutionally have not been free from tensions, and many challenges have been noted. In 1973, Dawson Gaylard, a literature person, asked in an article entitled, "Interdisciplinary Studies, Who Needs It?" I quote, she says, "Should or can science and the humanities come together harmoniously in a classroom? Or will one resemble the cannibal in the heart of darkness and not eat the other only because of some mysterious restraint? Why would an English instructor want to have anything to do with another discipline or with another department? Isn't literature interdisciplinary enough? So who needs interdisciplinary studies?" Now, remember, this was said in 1973. Gaylard was quite optimistic. She recognized the challenges entailed, but was very optimistic and felt that, yes, students and faculty would both benefit from the interdepartmental curriculum experiments that were taking place at Loyola University in the US, where she was based. But she also felt that it was important that in these experiments, one holds on to tradition as well as look to the future. In more recent times, too, many challenges have been noted, and there's been quite a lot of discussion in the literature about the possibilities for productive interface between disciplines and how its success and effectiveness can be gauged. Even within the social sciences and humanities, there are differences about the nature of reality, the object of inquiry, about how knowledge and data are conceptualized, not to mention the objectivity conundrum and the place of values and ethics in research. There are also very clear power differences in terms of access to material resources and cultural and social capital, as well as legitimacy issues across disciplines, especially across the social sciences when they are being compared with disciplines in the natural sciences. So this is not a level playing field, and any attempt at cross-disciplinary interactions is mediated by these political differences, which have to be negotiated. The sociologist John Homewood has written quite extensively about the challenges, for example, that sociology faces as a discipline in trying to reach to other disciplines, particularly in the natural sciences. In the modern period, the rise of neoliberal universities globally is not news, nor is this a secret. neoliberalism can be approached as an economic, political, and ideological project which has impacted all societal domains, including educational institutions. The descriptor neoliberal management model has been invoked to explain the rise of corporate universities marked by privatization and commodification, processes that have negatively impacted the pedagogical and intellectual commitment of universities. Given the continued entanglement of lingering coloniality and neocoloniality with modernity, therefore, part of the decolonizing project does also means contesting the hegemony of neoliberalism in higher education. I'm wary of strategic instrumental conceptions of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity that are driven by neoliberal logic. Within these frames, several strategies for cooperation and collaboration have nonetheless been proposed, some more favored in institutional reckoning than others. Some popular ones include working in research and teaching teams rather than individually, producing joint rather than sole-authored publications, and high citation counts of co-authored publications, which I'm sure we would all agree are limited measures at best and mechanical rather than meaningful registers of disciplinary dialogue. Regardless of the terms that are used, I want to say that I am in favor of encounters across disciplines in the humanities, social sciences, area studies, and natural sciences, and I recognize the value of such intellectual scholarly exchanges, but I also think of advocacy, activism, and community engagement in research and teaching as registers of disciplinary collaborations. Here I have invoked the expression cross-disciplinary quite deliberately and consciously, which reflects above all my own positive and productive experiences as a researcher and educator in reaching out across the aisle and drawing on the strengths of other disciplines. Yet my experiences also lead me to suggest that these disciplinary interactions also occur within disciplinary frames, given that disciplines are not themselves monolithic and homogeneous wholes to begin with. In my experience, cross-disciplinary interactions in teaching and research are best viewed as social practices grounded in relationships, personal ties, and friendships, as well as informal scholarly networks. In my experience, the exchange of ideas, the exposure to multiple methodologies and knowledges, and the learning possibilities these create are, I think, more enduring and meaningful. These encounters can begin in casual settings, organically and spontaneously, but can perhaps then lead to reading groups, research discussion groups, joint teaching efforts, team grant applications, and ultimately publications. However, the role of institutions is critical here, and we should expect, perhaps even demand, that institutions of research and higher education be enablers to ensure availability of time, resources, and create sites where these informal interactions across and within disciplines can be valued and nurtured. Much has been said about the value of disciplinary interactions as opportunities for making connections, knowledge and skills sharing, expanding the range of methodological options and theoretical options available to researchers, and therefore transcending the limitations of reliance on single disciplines. I agree in principle and in theory that these are desirable outcomes, although in practice, as I said, I still struggle to recognize what integrated or synthesized methodologies and theories mean, let alone explain these to students. For me, cross-disciplinary interactions and conversations have instead led to a critical self-reflexivity as a researcher and educator, and compelled me to turn the gaze, the lens, back on the disciplines that I've worked with, something that has seldom been acknowledged as a desired outcome of interdisciplinarity. I found a very nice exception in an article by Venkatesan Hayes, who has noted that, in her words, interdisciplinarity offers critical perspectives and constitutes a questioning of disciplinary truth itself. This idea speaks volubly to me and is what I find most inspiring and energizing about engaging multiple disciplines. As I have tried to demonstrate in this brief talk, trying to bridge ethnographic and archival research and infuse the teaching of sociology and anthropology modules with historical sensibilities has not only enabled me to rethink and reconfigure my own research and teaching practices, but to also create pathways for the larger project of decolonizing disciplines and contributing to remaking them in the process. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
was so powerful, and there were so many ideas, I think, especially for a lot of us who are thinking about interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity. And I think it was really strong to also say that, I mean, how seductive perhaps these neoliberal ideas of fund, and like especially in the funding context that you talked about, and how it can be quite easy to fall into those instrumental traps, but to actually use tools of decolonizing can be so powerful. So that was fantastic. Thank you. We now have about 20 minutes for some Q&A. There will be someone passing the mic around, so if anybody has any questions, just raise your hands. We also have questions coming in via Slido, so if you feel shy, you can always type in your questions into Slido and ask. Maybe I can start with one question, because I thought it was quite interesting about when you talked about the curriculums that you worked on and like sort of rethinking them, and you mentioned the criticisms around it and the resistance. I think it's quite interesting, especially because us, I'm working in the context of like global North University and like getting familiarized with the resistance. It's quite interesting to hear from perspectives of like your university and what that meant.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I did mention in passing that, you know, the efforts that we've made to rethink how to teach this particular course, social thought and social theory, has not been easy. I mean, in some ways, NUS has been a very enabling space, and we've had the freedom to curate modules in the way that we like, because there's no interference in the classroom. But a lot of these resistances and comments one actually hears in the corridors and in the canteens from colleagues. And some of this has to do with the fact that they're always gatekeepers, right? I mean, when you have a canon, you have gatekeepers. You can't keep the canon intact unless you have people who are committed to maintaining and policing its boundaries, right? So we have those, and I think they exist everywhere, not just in NUS. And so, yes, I have heard whispers in the corridors about, you know, what are they teaching? This is not even real sociology. How can you compare Harriet Martineau to Durkheim, right? So there are gatekeepers, I think, and I think, you know, part of the challenge has been to engage with these gatekeepers, not because they had any kind of authority on determining whether or not we could do what we wanted to do, but really to kind of try and generate a broader conversation about the idea to be more inclusive and to expose students to diverse curricula, I think. So those have happened. I've also been at conferences where I've presented papers. I remember I was at a conference in Jeju City, South Korea, where I presented a paper on Harriet Martineau, where a member of the audience stood up and who was a PhD, faculty member, stood up and was quite angry with me that I dared to compare Harriet Martineau with Durkheim, and what he said was that she doesn't even have a PhD in sociology, you know, and which then also revealed to me how little is known about figures like these. I mean, Harriet Martineau lived in the mid-19th century in the UK, where women did not have access to formal education. I mean, she was really a self-taught woman, and quite an incredible woman at that. So we've had these resistances. Sometimes we also hear from students who have become used to reading the great masters like Max Weber and Durkheim, and then when I introduce somebody like Harriet Martineau or someone like, I've also taught Ram Mohan Roy in that module, and then Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, who's a virtual unknown. Students do kind of sit up and notice and wonder why we are learning someone who is not a real sociologist, right? I've heard those kinds of comments, but we have persisted. I mean, I believe in the incremental, cumulative, revolutionary impact of making these little changes, seemingly little changes in the classroom. And we've been doing this for decades now, right? Which also in some ways is quite disheartening that after 20 years of doing this, right, we still get these criticisms. But I must say that in the last 5 to 10 years, there seems to have been a lot more traction and a momentum for the decolonizing project. I would say, which I think tends to overshadow the enthusiasm for post-colonial thought. I mean, that's my reading. I mean, I seem to see a lot more enthusiasm for talking about decoloniality than post-colonial criticism. So.
Maybe one of the Slido questions.
Thank you very much. So some questions are coming through on Slido, and there's two related questions. So one is, to what extent should decolonizing pedagogy prioritize students' inputs on curriculum as a means to reduce differentials between students and staff? So a question on power there. And then kind of related to this is a request to see if you can share any anecdotes about any interesting pedagogical opportunities that arose from inviting students to shape and feed into the reading list. Maybe something that's led to something unexpected or something particularly powerful, so those feel related.
Okay, thank you. So let me take the first question. Yes, so I think, yes, I think students are very important. I'm coming from Bielefeld. 2 days ago, I was at Bielefeld University, and I gave a talk on contesting the hegemony of neoliberal universities. And there I talked about teaching and learning as collaborative activities, and the fact that students should be engaged in the classroom, not just as passive recipients of knowledge that's being delivered by the educator, but really it's important to engage students. And it was very interesting. One of the questions that I received at the end of my talk was in defense of students, right? And this person said, don't you think that's putting too much of a burden on students, because young people are expected to do so much these days, including, save the planet and climate change and all of that. Are we now going to expect them to curate curricula for us? We should be doing that, right? And my response, I was very amused, but my response to her was that, I think we would all agree that it is in the interests of students and educators alike for students to take ownership and responsibility for their own learning, right? And so I think it's very important to keep that door open. And also, if you really want to take, Paulo Freire seriously, then yes, the classroom is a site for revolution. And more recently, others have written about the classroom as spaces of hope. Like David Harvey, for example, has written quite a lot about what it means to conceive of the classroom as a space for hope. And I think, in the classroom, it's not just the educator, there are students present, and I think it would be such a waste of talent if one were not to reach out to students and invite them. And so yes, I definitely agree that this is something is important and worthwhile to do, and this is not sort of deflecting my own responsibilities as an educator, but really trying to move towards a model of collaborative learning. And we as educators learn from students as well. I think we need to accept that happily. In terms of an example, yes, I can cite an example from the module that we taught, Social Thought and Social Theory, where the term paper actually required students to construct their own questions. And because we were introducing new figures, we felt that introducing new figures and focusing on their intellectual biographies gave us a way of talking about larger thematics and problematics in the discipline, right? So the figure becomes a kind of an important anchor, and then you can go in many different ways, institutions they worked with, what did they publish, what other work did they do, etc. So we invited, the final term project was asking students to come up with a figure on their own, right, that they would have been familiar with from their own experiences, because we can only provide a certain number of options, but students may have been familiar with others. So we had students from China who came up with examples. One student wanted to write about Sun Yat-sen, right? We had, of course, students from India, many of them who wanted to write about Gandhi and Ram Mohan Roy. So we did actually construct the course outline in a way that invited and legitimized student input, right? But we did, of course, ask students to come and talk to us before so that we could think through whether this was a feasible option, because sometimes they selected figures who may not have given them the bandwidth to explore the themes that we wanted to explore. So yeah, we do invite students in to do that kind of thing.
I think we have a question here. Oh, no? Yeah. On top, I don't know if I need that, but go ahead. Thank you.
Apologies if this isn't very well thought through. It was something that developed as you were talking. And I know you said you're wary of sort of strategic ventures into interdisciplinary studies and also decolonizing work, but it is a reality of, I guess, the world that we're operating in, that it is money-led. And so I was thinking about what you said in your opening statement about when you were saying that interestingly, it was in institutions that had limited resources that led to them having interdisciplinary and collaborative work together. So it was almost resource-driven collaborations. And then linking that with this idea that really this sort of input into collaborative work has really sort of taken off in sort of the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And I'm wondering how much of that might be down to resource squeezing. We operate in an institution, not just like the individual institution, but the academy itself, which does have a hierarchy of knowledge in which money is pushed into sort of the harder sciences, medicine. And it's early career researchers, basically anyone without a permanent position, that is left struggling to not only fund projects that they're interested in, but actually find secure work. A lot of calls for interdisciplinary funding now are asking for outputs that demonstrate significant impact in the world. So you get a lot of sort of social sciences wanting to work within medicine, wanting to work within psychiatry, etc., because that's where the money is. And I just wanted your thoughts on sort of how we can manage this in a non-business strategy way that still allows us to reap the economic benefits, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that question and your detailed thoughts on it. Yes, I mean, that's a question I've been asked before when I've talked about, the problems of instrumental interdisciplinarity. And one person stood up at a talk and said to me, what are you really worried about? Like, what's wrong with interdisciplinarity? And I had to clarify that, in spirit and principle and ethos, I have no objections to interdisciplinarity. I mean, I use it in my own work, and it's been very, very productive for me. I guess I'm sort of thinking about what happens to the idea of interdisciplinarity when it lands in bureaucratic hands. And I think that is part of the problem. And you're right, of course, it's a lot of it is resource driven, right? That money speaks. Many people have talked about this. I guess the one of the most prominent people who've talked about this is Martha Nussbaum, right? Who has actually said that a flourishing economy and financial growth are great for democracy. So, social science and humanities research should put itself in the service of the neoliberal project rather than run from it, right? I disagree completely on that, right? I mean, I think it's even more imperative in this climate to be even more committed to values-driven research, right? And I'm not saying this as a soft option, and I'm not saying that humanities and social science research don't have a relevance to industry, right? I recently oversaw the introduction of an anthropology major anthropology as an undergraduate major in NUS, in the department, right? We only used to have a sociology major, but we never had an undergraduate. And in the course of the conversations I had to have with our Ministry of Education, which funds the university, right? I was asked to justify why anthropology as a new major should be introduced, right? So I provided, intellectual, scholarly, methodological arguments about, this is really important, anthropology, this has all this to say. After several rounds of back and forth, they finally came back to me and said, all this is okay, but can anthropology graduates find jobs, right? And it took many years for this to happen, 3-4 years for this to happen, and ultimately I had to go out. So I said, yes, of course they can find jobs. So I provided examples of professions that anthropology graduates have moved into globally, and they said, no, globally is fine, but what about in Singapore? The government is putting money into training undergraduates as contributors to the economy. Can they find jobs in Singapore? So I had to go out and get letters of expression, what is it called? Letters of commitment from various players, right? The public sector, but they were particularly interested in the private sector, right? Will industries give anthropology graduates a job? So I had to work really hard and accumulate evidence to demonstrate that anthropology graduates would not be standing with begging bowls, essentially, right? And once I was able to do that, because I got these letters of commitment from like various CEOs of companies which I will not name, you know, and of course also from the government itself. I mean, the ministries have always used anthropology graduates, it's not an issue. But anyway, so yes, money talks, and so, you know, even a decision of whether to introduce a major into a university required kind of satisfying the market before. So those are very real constraints, I totally agree with you. I think it is possible to do interdisciplinary work. I think it's very possible to do good interdisciplinary work without sort of being reduced to a very mechanical way of registering interdisciplinarity, right? So, you know, sometimes interdisciplinarity can be vested in one person, right? You don't have to have like a whole team of people. So how interdisciplinarity is conceptualized, I think, is very important, right? It's not, I mean, I as a single person have done qualitative sociology, anthropology, and history, so I am walking interdisciplinarity in that sense, right? But the other, I think, challenge for the humanities, and particularly for some of the social sciences, is that we do what has been negatively called solitary work or solitary scholarship, where working alone has been seen as a weakness, right? Oh, you work alone, like, are you not part of a team? And so there's this push to get like large teams, research teams going, right? You have an political scientist, you have an anthropologist, you have an economist, etc. And you know, what I'm saying is that the mere presence of, you know, 4 practitioners from 4 different disciplines doesn't constitute genuine interdisciplinarity. So I do believe that, I mean, of course, one has to be smart about these things as well, because, you know, if you're not going to get the grants that you need to do the research, etc., then you can complain all you like about, you know, how mechanical the process is, but it's not going to get you anywhere. But I think it is possible to perhaps engage in a kind of public service where, as academics, as researchers, you know, we educate university managers and bureaucrats about how they should look at interdisciplinarity. I mean, there's a lot of institutional interest, including here in UCL, right? And a lot of funding is going there. So, I mean, in order to do sort of genuine, deep, conceptual, interdisciplinary work, right, it's not going to cost any more money in that sense, right? But perhaps it takes, you know, more work on the part of the people who are claiming to be doing interdisciplinary work to justify and to present a case, right? So I think it's possible to do that. I sit on various boards which review grant applications, and I'm beginning to see those, right? So, I mean, it also bears notice that a lot of universities are actually encouraging research in the humanities, right? We hear all the time, people are saying, oh, I wish there was an anthropology application, you know, I wish more humanities people would apply for these large grant applications. I mean, anthropologists in particular just don't know what to do with money, right? I mean, you give me $50,000 and I'll struggle to spend it, you know, as a sole researcher, whereas if you give it to a group of demographers and sociologists, 50,000 is nothing, right? They just give it to their interlocutors as you know, whatever money for participating in the project. So, you know, so that's an issue. But the thing is, I think it is important that institutions learn, you know, what good interdisciplinary work is, and I think we can do that. I think we can try and, I don't know, some kind of a public education of university managers, and they might appreciate that and emerge as enlightened policymakers at the end of it, right? Rather than kind of mechanically work with this notion of interdisciplinarity, which doesn't really achieve the kind of lofty goals of interdisciplinary studies in the first place, right?
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Are there any more questions? Because I think we might just have time for one more question after this. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I wanted to ask this because this is kind of a lot of what I come up against often when I'm having conversations about decolonization, and it's about how do we kind of like have a revolution in our epistemological and methodological foundations while still maintaining a sense of rigor and validity, and kind of what framework can we use especially one that we can share between kind of different people that, you know, want to be involved in producing knowledge, when all the frameworks we've been given have kind of like issues with them. And I think that's kind of, yeah, I guess how do we replace those frameworks for kind of saying this is a good piece of knowledge, this is a valid piece of knowledge. Yeah, that's my whole question.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so in my response to the last question, I was going to say something which I forgot, but I just remembered that, which was that, you know, I sit on a lot of these committees which evaluate grant proposals when they come through, including proposals from the humanities and social sciences other than economics and psychology, right? You know, as I said, the people welcome, there's money for research, and so, you know, these grant proposals are welcomed, which is great. But I think what needs to change is how we evaluate these grant proposals, right? Because the same criteria seem to be used. So very often, a lot of qualitative work, for example, gets dismissed as anecdotal. What's interesting is anecdotal, but is this evidence-based, right? Does this have impact? And I think, you know, we also now need to educate boards which are evaluating proposals about how to think about evidence in the first place, right? Or how to think about impact in the ways that is meaningful, right? And so there is a tendency for these boards to still operate with sort of criteria that are generated from quantitative studies and experimental designs, even more specific, right? Which, so on the one hand, they say, yeah, please send your, you know, humanities proposals, and then when you do that, then it goes through the same sort of screening process, right? Which is completely counterproductive. So I think that also needs to shift in terms of how these grant proposals, or any proposal, not just for grants, is evaluated in terms of its rigor. And you know, qualitative methodologies are rigorous, right? But they just are rigorous in a different way. And I think perhaps also, I think qualitative researchers need to work harder at demonstrating, you know, what rigor means for us, rather than say it's different from quantitative researchers, right? Because that's not persuasive. So I think it's possible to do that. I you know, in my talk, I'd mentioned in my book, I've used official archives, but I've also used private archives, what I call, and all archives are curated, right? So I'm not saying private archives are better than official archives, but, you know, official archives are problematic because you clearly know that there were people who had certain agendas and interests who curated those in certain ways, therefore expect silences, expect omissions, expect gaps, but then you need to theorize all of those gaps as well. Private archives provide another source of information, but for the most part, you know, private archives are sort of, people are suspicious of those, right? Or if it comes from your family collection or something, unless it's deposited in the archives, then it's not valuable. There's also, I think, tensions between the value that we accord to the written word, right? What is written somehow has greater legitimacy than orality, right? And which is why a lot of historians, I'm sorry if there are any historians here, not all, some historians are skeptical of interviews, right? How can you believe what people are saying? They're just saying it. How can you believe that? But you can believe what is written, right? But, you know, that's, and why? So I think there are a number of different things that need to shift, right? Sort of prioritizing, you know, different voices, different sites, you know, different media through which knowledge is accessed, you know, visual, memory. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done on social memory and remembrances these days, but, you know, there's still skepticism about, well, can you really believe what people actually did that actually happen, right? But this requires a kind of shift theoretically, right? I mean, if you talk about memories, right, it's all historically and socially constructed and produced, right? And if one is comfortable with that, then there's no problem. But if you're looking for truth and facts, then, you know, that's going to be much harder to find. So you can point to other things like, you know, non-official sources, you know, family collections of images, you know, memories. Biography, I think, is a really important site. So I think we do need to work harder ourselves at presenting a case for why these constitute valid and meaningful, you know, sites where knowledge is generated without falling into the trap of replicating what the quantitative frameworks expect us to do.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more? Because, okay, so let's take one of the slides.
Yes, so given this is likely the last question, I apologise to the questions Slido won't get to, but I've selected one that connects with something I noted down whilst you were talking about, maybe an observation that in the last 10, 15 years, some of the decolonisation of the curriculum and so on has changed the canon slightly or made some sort of difference recently. And the question related to that, in my mind, at least anyway, is Barmer warned against decolonial perspectives becoming only additive to curriculum. So how can we ensure a transformative and long-lasting commitment? So it's also quite a good one to finish on.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, so, I'd mentioned that, I've seen this kind of momentum and attraction for decolonizing projects, right? I mean, in every field, right? Not just in education, but in other domains as well. It's happening in like arts and theater and everywhere it's happening. So how to ensure that this doesn't become a passing fad in a sense? Well, it's difficult. I don't think that the responsibility for this lies with institutions. I mean, I can give you my own example. I've been working in the National University of Singapore, and my colleague Farid and I have been working in it for 20 years. And when we meet colleagues at international conferences, everyone gets the impression that the Department of Sociology is an extremely enlightened, everybody is doing decolonial work, but they're not. It's just a handful of us who's doing it, right? And so this is really sustained, through personal doggedness and determination in that sense. It takes time for this to register some kind of a change, but I guess part of it is that people like us. So Farid and I are just two small examples, but there are people everywhere in India, in Southeast Asia, etc., who are working on these ideas, and a lot of this work has now come to light, right? In terms of being published, and the scholarship about them is visible. And I think that has made a difference as well. So, in the past, people used to say, well, we would like to teach this, but then there's nothing for us to assign. Like, what do we assign to our students to read this, right? Who do we read? And so some of this work has, which is, again, also not accurate, because a lot of the decolonial work has been happening since the 60s, at least, if not earlier. So the work has been there. Although, as students, we were not introduced. I was never introduced to these ideas as a student, right? This is something that I really only picked up as a graduate student, and quite accidentally. So the downside of it being in the hands of individuals is that if it's not institutionalized, then it's not passed down from one cohort to another, and therefore, there's a risk that it will disappear. So we've been teaching this course in this manner, but this course is offered every semester. So in the other semester, it is taught in the old mold, right? And there's nothing we can do about that. So it really does depend on the individual, unless, and I would also frankly not like to see an institution say to everybody, from now on, everybody has to teach decolonization. I think that's equally oppressive, right, in that sense. So it is challenging, but I mean, if I can make a comment about decolonial, right? I like the notion of decoloniality because it has offered me a method of praxis in the classroom, right? I'm very supportive of post-colonial work, and I enjoy reading, any number of scholars that we can name, from Said to Spivak to Baba to, so many others, Talal Asad. But, it is in the decolonial discourse that I have found a method and a way forward, right, in terms of the praxis. And I also like the fact that decolonial scholarship recognizes that coloniality persists in modernity, right? And therefore decolonization also means attending to the colonial aspect of what it means to be modern, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I think there's now a reception after this in Robert's foyer. I'm not sure how, but I think there are signs outside to lead you there. So please do join us for the reception and stay, and you can talk to Professor Vineeta Sinha.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.